training for war. So why did the army want to turn players into soldiers? I met military historian Andrew Riddoch. What was the formation of the football battalion an attempt to do?
When it was set up, it was always envisaged that professional footballers would join and they would be used to encourage the club supporters to join up beside them. Some of these people would have been real heroes of the game. There was an attraction of serving alongside people who they turned up every week to watch. Two major concessions were granted to the footballers battalion. One was that the height requirement was waived. The height requirement was 5'3", and because a lot of footballers were quite small, this was waived. And the other one was that the players could continue to turn out for their clubs until the end of the season.
At camps like these, Walter trained with the battalion through the week, then, on Saturdays, travelled across the country to play for Northampton. He stood out in the football battalion and was rapidly promoted to Lance Sergeant. And he played right up until the final game of the season, in what was to be his last appearance as a professional footballer.
In November 1915, Walter finished his basic training with the 1st Football, and the battalion boarded a ship at Folkestone and crossed the English Channel, set for war-torn France. This was no longer a game.
But no amount of training could have prepared him to face the horrific realities of the Western Front. The war was being fought from muddy trenches that ran for hundreds of miles across northern France. Young men who signed up in search of glory were being slaughtered in their thousands. The Kaiser's army were making advances, and husbands, brothers, sons, and teammates died every day in their attempts to stop the German onslaught.
As an NCO, Walter would have been taken straight to the front line, where he would have experienced firsthand the confusion, the chaos, and the carnage, but also the camaraderie and the courage of frontline life.
They were sent almost immediately to a really difficult part of the front line around Givenchy and Festubert, which all of the soldiers hated because the trenches, you couldn't build deep trenches because it was very sandy. And so you'd be sheltering behind butts and sandbags and stuff. So, you know, the death rate was high and it was constant kind of exchange of fire. And so those first few months were a real shock to Walter.
In the freezing, muddy trenches, Walter fought shoulder to shoulder with his comrades in the football battalion. It was a terrifying environment, where to survive, men had to trust one another. And I want to know if even here Walter was judged by the color of his skin. So I met with military historian Richard Holmes. I want to talk a little bit about the men who would have served alongside Walter. May they have had certain opinions about fighting alongside a black man, you know, as an equal?
They might very well have had some reservations, but I mean, here was a man who was brave, who had a great reputation as a footballer beforehand, and he had a lot going for him. I mean, this is a crucible which brings men close, and they get closer to one another than you and I could possibly imagine. So most of the people that he soldiered with wouldn't have had those attitudes to race.
Would it have been a tremendous shock, what they saw and experienced in those early days?
It wasn't simply a shock because you had a chance of being killed and wounded, but the physical conditions of the front, wet and cold, and you would be dirty and you would have lice. And then the experience of trench life, and with it sniping and shelling, was a shock.
During a break in hostilities, Walter wrote what he hoped would be a reassuring letter to his guardians at the orphanage, where he described the unnerving mix of tension and adrenaline.
For the last 3 weeks, my battalion has been resting some miles distant from the firing line, but we are now going up to the trenches for a month or so. Afterwards, we shall begin to think of coming home on leave. It is a monotonous life out here when we're supposed to be resting, and most of the boys prefer the excitement of the trenches to the comparative inaction whilst in reserve.
We don't know whether Walter's eagerness to see more frontline conflict was bravado, inexperience, or whether he was hiding the true nature of the conflict. But what we do know is that when Walter did finally see what he called the excitement of the trenches, it very nearly destroyed him.
On April the 28th, 1916, the slaughter, the panic, and the unrelenting horror of war took its toll on Walter. He was diagnosed with acute mania, what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and was removed from the front line. It was his 28th birthday.
Very often it was associated with bombardment, hence the expression often used shell shock, because it was believed that it originated from the concussion effect of a bursting shell, which simply rocked your brain. Actually, not so. We would now call this some form of stress reaction to what happened in battle, psychiatric rather than physical. What had happened to Walter is that something wholly shocking, probably connected with artillery bombardment, had knocked him off balance, and he was going to need time to recover.
Nobody could ever have envisaged the industrial scale of the horror and carnage of the First World War. If the phrase hell on earth has any meaning, it's had a meaning then, and I think it broke Walter.
The sheer terror that Walter and the other men faced on a daily basis is difficult for my generation to imagine. But even on a warm autumn day, 92 years later, these surviving trenches seem haunted by the ghosts of the past.
To be here gives me a real sense of Walter, because I don't think you can understand Walter Tull without understanding those months and those years towards the end of his life and what he went through. I feel being here as if it brings me slightly closer to him. I feel I've got a better sense of who he was and how these experiences forged the man.
Walter was returned to England to recover. The friends he left behind he would never see again. Half the football battalion fell as casualties on the Somme that summer. By the end of the war, only 30 men remained, and the 1st Football Battalion was disbanded. Five months later, Walter returned to the Western Front with a new regiment. His courage in overcoming shell shock and the way he commanded the respect of his men were noted by his commanding officer. And then, in November 1916, something unprecedented happened. Sergeant W.D. Tull, a black working-class man, was recommended for officer training. Up until then, there'd never been a black officer in a UK-based combat regiment before. And this is the part of Walter's story that's always bothered me. Could it really be that the British Army didn't believe that black men were fit to become officers? So I've come here to the National Archive to see if Walter's military record can shed some light on this crucial question. And taking me through his record is the National Archive's military specialist, William Spencer. So what have we got in front of us here?
We have here the record of service of Walter Tull. We actually have the form for his commission. So we get Walter Daniel Tull, date of birth, 28th of April 1888. Whether married, no. Whether of pure European descent, no. Whether British subject by birth or naturalisation, by birth.
Right, if I can just come to the fourth point that says whether of pure European descent. Of course, Walter answers no to that, but could you clarify what that exactly meant from a military perspective?
Basically, what they were really trying to do was to grant commissions to people with white people. I think it's to put it in basic terms. Whilst this form might appear to be very rigid and saying, well, we only want to commission white people, they do actually have subsequent questions. It's not that sole question and there's not a form of get-out.
Was it army policy not to commission anybody who wasn't of pure European descent?
The rules are there for interpretation.
Do you believe a colour bar, such as we understand it, existed at the period when Walter joined and served?
It's not categorical, you will not. Of course they want to ask the question.
I want to get clarification of why whether of pure European descent is on this form. It seems to me that this is a racist question, right? What I want to do is have a look at the manual of military law.
This is the British Army's definitive rule book from the time, and it clearly states, commissions in the Special Reserve of Officers are given to qualified candidates who are natural-born or naturalised British subjects of pure European descent.
Why specifically was that there?
The form says, asks a question which, yes, it is probably racist, and they want white men to command white troops.
What was it they were afraid of?
Black officers commanding white men.
But why?
But why, yes.
What I'm trying to get a handle on is why the army didn't see a black man commanding white troops as a perfectly natural thing for a man of Walter's abilities to do.
I think it comes down to the issue of respect and whether a white ordinary soldier would respect a black officer.
Here, in black and white, buried in the Army's legal tomes, is evidence of just how exceptional Walter Tull was.
The rules were broken and the rule book was thrown away in this case, and you know, legally he should never have been recommended, never have got past the actual application stage, but because of the quality of the man and the strength of his character, he got through and was appointed to commission on the end of May 1917.
The fact that Walter wasn't of pure European descent would have been an absolute prohibition. Now, I don't think for a moment it was right, and one of the things that commissioning someone like Walter Tull did was made a start, a very small start, in reversing that great tide of what I would call instinctive, deep-seated cultural prejudice.
Walter may have set a precedent, but the colour bar remained. The next black officer in the British Army wasn't commissioned for another 23 years. In order to understand Walter, to make sense of his legacy and his achievements, it's important to look at documents like the documents I have in front of me, the documents that state that they didn't want black officers to be commissioned within the UK-based regiments, because then you get an understanding of Walter's special qualities and the fact that he was a man within all that was able to get his head down, get on with the job, and serve with distinction. And I think that's something to be applauded and respected in Walter Tull. Walter was appointed to a commission in the Special Reserve of Officers and spent the spring of 1917 training on Scotland's west coast.